Greetings, welcome to the Thought Decoders channel, where we study logic and see its use, how to use it. Today, my name is Sean Mixon. I am the Thought Decoder. Today we're going to look at one of Christian philosophy's greatest leaders, greatest thinkers, and writers of the past 50 years. None other than Alvin Plantinga. He is a giant. He's influenced people, especially like William Lane Craig, who's the top apologist, or one of the top apologists today. I actually came across Alvin Plantinga I believe from listening to William Lane Craig and reading his writings. Alvin Plantinga is an analytic philosopher. Basically, that's a philosophical approach that has its traditions in the history of philosophy. People like Aristotle, Plato, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Duns Scotus, William Ockham, Leibniz, etc. Those people who placed an attention to argumentation, a focus on argument, a focus on introducing your terms before you use them and not using them without defining those terms. That's Alvin Plantinga's approach. We're going to look at what he says about Christian philosophy and analytic philosophy, specifically, and how it relates to Christianity. Should Christians be afraid of analytic philosophy, or should they embrace it as a tool? Alvin Plantinga answers that question in the paper we're going to take a look at today. Let's jump in. So let's jump right in. Messing with this mic. Okay, so Analytic Philosophy and Christianity by Alvin Plantinga. One important aspect of 20th century philosophy is the rise of what has been variously called analytic, critical, or linguistic philosophy. This was written in 1963, by the way. As in most such cases, no exact date can be assigned to its beginnings. But modern analytic philosophy got its start, we may say, around the turn of the century when Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher and mathematician, and G.E. Moore, another philosopher, began to rebel against the Hegelian idealism of their teachers. Hegelian idealism was this abstract, obtuse philosophy, impractical philosophy written by Hegel, who was a German philosopher. His approach was very their philosophy was, I think they had some type of spiritual element to their philosophy. Like they believe themselves to be, I think this is where the notion that philosophy is about very weird thoughts and ideas. I think that come from Hegel and German idealists. Not that they called what they were doing analytic philosophy or anything of the sort. These labels didn't gain currency until considerably later, but their approach to philosophy and their ways of handling philosophical problems already characterized analytic philosophy, perhaps because it began as a revolt against Hegelianism. Analytic philosophy is widely regarded as destructive. Iconoclastic means they go against the mainstream or the traditional approach. Force. People often associate it with skepticism and with religious skepticism as much as skepticism of Hegelian dialectics. Hence, many Christian intellectuals darkly mistrust analytic philosophy, suspecting that it is either a danger to the faith or a trivial waste of time. Then he cites an American Baptist. He cites an article. Now, this attitude seems to me to embody a great mistake. In what follows, I shall explain why I think so. So now he's going to talk about misconceptions of analytic philosophy. Almost everyone knows that such a thing as analytic philosophy exists, and that contemporary English and American philosophers typically are doing philosophy in a way recognizably different from that of their forebears of, say, 50 or to 75 years ago. So I'm thinking this was written in 63, 50 years prior to that. 63. So 63 years prior to that would have been 1900. 1890. 1900 and minus 7 would be 1893. So that would be 70 years. And he said 75 years, so that would be 1888, I believe. 1888. So 50. So from the 1880s all the way to 1963 is the time period he's talking about. Much of an idea as to what analytic philosophy is, so 50 to 75 years ago, but most persons outside of the ranks of professional philosophers don't really have much of an idea as to what analytic philosophy is. So he's basically saying people who were not professional philosophers didn't really know what analytic philosophy was at this time, and they still don't today. Some people seem to believe, for example, that analytic philosophers occupy themselves exclusively with language, with words and sentences, and what is and isn't good English, rather than with the traditional concerns of philosophy. And these critics justifiably add, concerned with such questions as what the difference is between the words highly and very, is something of a come down for the queen of the sciences. Queen of the sciences, philosophy was famously called the queen of the sciences, I believe by St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a philosopher himself. Now, while there may be some analytic philosophers of whose work this is a recognizable caricature, there are many more who talk about language as such infrequently, if at all. G. Moore and Bertrand Russell are prominent examples. So he's saying here that Moore and Russell don't talk about language as much. Other people seem to think that analytic philosophers, and so just to summarize this paragraph, some people think analytic philosophy was about studying language. Next he says, other people seem to think that analytic philosophers pretty much confine themselves to logic or questions about logic, which would be the philosophy of logic. So they kind of conflated or confused analytic philosophy with the philosophy of logic. Now, developments in logic have certainly played an important part in the development of contemporary analytic philosophy, but then logic has always been intimately related to philosophy, and most analytic philosophers have been interested in logic not for its own sake so much as for its use in dealing with extra-logical philosophical problems. And of course, there are many analytic philosophers who don't seem to care much about logic in any traditional sense at all. So he's saying analytic philosophers use logic to solve philosophical problems, but they're not really interested in logic per se, just for its own. It's just not interested in just studying logic just to study logic, but it's the application of logic, which analytic philosophers typically focus on. So that's why here on the Thought Decoder channel, we teach logic and its application. Because I'm an analytic philosopher, and that's our tool. So, and of course, there are many analytic philosophers. Okay, we just read that. Keep going. Still, others apparently believe that, however, one is to describe analytic philosophy, it is certainly quite different from traditional philosophy, and indeed is explicitly hostile to it. So let's just review. Some people thought analytic philosophy was about studying language. Others thought it was about studying logic. And here he thinks he's saying that some people thought it was about going against traditional philosophy or being hostile towards traditional philosophy. Here again, there's a grain of truth in this idea. Some analytic philosophers, particularly some years ago, thought of themselves as making a complete break with traditional philosophy. They believed that analytic philosophy represented a radical new departure, enabling us finally to settle most of the traditional questions of philosophy, not by answering them, but by showing that the questions themselves are really nonsensical and can't sensibly be asked. So basically, they were saying that the questions were meaningless. They had no meaning. So that the problem was these philosophers were trying to solve questions that lacked meaning. Chief among this group were perhaps the logical positivists. They held that most of the traditional problems of philosophy aren't problems at all, but simply the products of confusion. I'll say more about the positivists later. What's important here is to see that positivism is by no means to be identified with analytic philosophy. So here's a misconception, thinking that analytic philosophy and philosophers were all logical positivists. But he's saying there were analytic philosophers who were logical positivists, but not all were. That's what this point he's about to make. Indeed, it is not easy at present to find a philosopher who is willing to call himself a logical positivist, and there is now a great deal of interest and concern among analytic philosophers with the great traditional problems of philosophy: human freedom, the nature of knowledge, the existence of God, the mind-body problem, and the problem of universals, to name only a few. So he's saying that this view is mistaken because you do have analytic philosophers who are interested in traditional problems of philosophy. Granted that these are misconceptions, then what is analytic or critical philosophy? I do not know how to give anything like a completely adequate definition, but perhaps the following from an eminent practitioner of analytic philosophy is as good as any. The analysis and definition of our fundamental concepts. This is a quote. The analysis and definition of our fundamental concepts and the clear statement of resolute criticism of our fundamental beliefs I call critical philosophy. So let's see what he just said. The analysis, so you analyze, you look at the parts of concepts. What parts would in the concept and fundamental concepts? So the concepts we use to understand larger ideas, we analyze those concepts, we define those concepts, and it says the clear statement. So you state those beliefs and you critique your fundamental beliefs. So it's about analyzing fundamental concepts, defining those concepts, critiquing your beliefs, and stating your beliefs clearly. Those four things he considers the approach of analytic philosophy. So analysis and definition of fundamental concepts, concepts that are used in the construction of larger ideas. So I'm defining that. and stating clearly and critiquing your fundamental beliefs, your basic beliefs. Fundamental maybe in the sense of your worldview of what's the essence of reality, maybe. I call critical philosophy. Okay. And that was C.D. Broad, Scientific Thought, page 18. Analytic philosophy is, first of all, philosophy, and it differs from non-analytic philosophy, it seems to me, chiefly in the following ways. First, its investigations tend to be piecemeal, thorough, and detailed. So you build. Secondly, you put small parts together. You focus on details. You take your time and you're very thorough in your analysis. So maybe that relates to, it's kind of different from the definition he gave, C.D. Broad gave. Secondly, analytic philosophers pay a great deal of attention to argument and counter-argument. Okay, C.D. Broad didn't say anything about argument. Maybe criticism of your fundamental beliefs, maybe that has to do with argument. Okay, secondly, analysts pay attention to argument and counter-argument. They are less likely to announce startling theses with no argument or only a half-hearted argument than their non-analytic counterparts. And finally, analytic philosophers, the better ones at any rate, strive mightily for clarity. Okay, and this is where we want to stop and focus on. They try very hard to say exactly what they mean. They try never to introduce new terminology without carefully explaining what they propose to mean by it. One might think this is a relatively modest goal, but in philosophy, it is a great deal harder than it sounds. Okay, so let's look at this again. Alvin Plantinga's understanding of analytic philosophy. You investigate, there's a process of discovery, of a searching. It's speculative in that sense. It's investigative, it's exploratory. So in those investigations are piecemeal, thorough, and detailed. You put things together as you discover them or conclude them. You take your time. You don't get in a rush. You look at you examine something thoroughly, and you look at the details. So secondly, analytic philosophers pay great deal of attention to argument and counter-argument. So you're focusing on an argument, and you're looking at counter-arguments, how to refute whatever argument that is your focus. They are less likely to announce startling theses with no argument. So they're not just making claims. It's not a philosophy of just making claims like Hegel claiming that reality is this way. Reality is, there's thesis and antithesis and synthesis. And history moves in that pattern. You just don't make claims, but you argue for claims. Or only a half-hearted argument than their non-analytic counterparts. And finally, analytic philosophers, the better ones at any rate, strive mightily for clarity. So you look at argument, counter-argument, clarity, and you systematically build. So it's systematic approach. It's an approach that focuses on argument, counter argument, and clarity. Okay, so now that was the main crux. What I wanted to get out of this video was to show you guys how to do analytic philosophy. Then we're going to go through and see some more of its uses and what else Alvin Plantinga had to say about Christianity and analytic philosophy. Novel in emphasis. It is apparent, I think, that analytic philosophy in this sense is really nothing new. Most of the great philosophers of the past were analytic philosophers to some degree or other. A great deal of Plato's work, for example, is surely of a piece with contemporary analytic philosophy, particularly his determined attempts to explicate such concepts as those of justice, virtue, wisdom, and the like. Much the same may be said about Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham are analytic philosophers par excellence. Their work is markedly characterized by careful argumentation and determined attempts at clarity. Descartes, Berkeley, Leibniz, Spinoza to a lesser degree. All these exhibit to at least some extent the qualities I ascribe to analytic philosophers. And the work of Hume and Kant, of course, is thoroughly germane to contemporary analytic philosophy. In short, the foes of analytic philosophy and some of its most ardent proponents make the same mistake here. Both vastly overestimate the extent to which analytic philosophy breaks with the tradition. Okay, so basically people who were analytic philosophers and people who were against analytic philosophy made the same mistake of thinking that analytic philosophy breaks with tradition. He's arguing that look at these characteristics of analytic philosophers, the focus on argument, counter-argument, systematic approach, and emphasis on clarity. Then he says, well, look, there are other philosophers who have had this approach prior to analytic philosophy: Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, Leibniz. So he's basically saying, so that's the misconception is false. So he's arguing against that view. To be sure, the work of any contemporary analytic philosopher and that of, say, Hegel, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, or Kierkegaard seem hardly to belong to the same discipline at all. But the same goes for the work of any of these and, for example, Occam or Leibniz. A great deal of contemporary analytic philosophy is profoundly traditional. So he's basically saying it's Hegel, his German idealism, Nietzsche was a German philosopher, Schopenhauer, philosopher of theology, a philosophical theologian to some sense. In some sense, not very familiar with him, but Kierkegaard was an existentialist philosopher. And he's right. You read their writing, it's like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? But he's also saying that contemporary philosophers are different from even those philosophers who had analytic tendencies, Occam or Leibniz. Now, I say that it is a mistake for the Christian intellectual to regard analytic philosophy with suspicious hostility. It is a mistake, first of all, because analytic philosophy can make an important contribution to Christian apologetics. The intellectual world of the 20th century has been full of forces running flatly counter to the spirit of Christianity. Consider, for example, the logical positivists. Okay. So now he's saying Christians make a mistake when they're suspicious of analytic philosophy, because analytic philosophy can aid the Christian and be used as a tool of apologetics, which is this defense and statement, rational defense of Christian belief. The intellectual world, continuing, of the 20th century has been full of forces running flatly counter to the spirit of Christianity. Consider, for example, the logical positivists. So now he's bringing back in these logical positivists who wanted to say that certain claims of philosophy, ethics, etc., were meaningless. Certain metaphysics questions of the nature of reality were meaningless. So that was the problem. Problems that philosophers were asking questions without meaning, and that's why they couldn't solve them. It might be a simplification, but let's look and see how Alvin Plantinga characterizes it, and we'll continue. So consider, for example, the logical positivists who were not prepared to concede that religious beliefs were even false. They devoted a tremendous amount of ingenuity and effort to showing that such alleged statements as God exists, make that bold, or God was incarnate in Christ are appearances to the contrary utterly meaningless, in much the same way in which 'twas brilliant and the slithy toves did gear. I think Lewis Carroll wrote that. Alice in Wonderland is meaningless. Lewis Carroll, by the way, just was a logician. He studied logic and philosophy. They are, according to the positivists, mere strings of words which appear to mean something, but really don't. And accordingly, of course, they aren't either true or false any more than Bix is. What the positivists did was this. They tried to state a criterion, roughly verifiability by sense experience, which any alleged statement must satisfy if it is not to be nonsensical. This criterion was called the verifiability criterion. And in their palmy days, which was the 1930s, the positivists wielded their new weapon with vigor and assurance, bordering on arrogance. Metaphysical statements, theological propositions, ethical statements, religious beliefs, all were declared meaningless and worthy to be cast into outer darkness. That's an allusion to Scripture. Only the observable accept it now. The positivists were, so maybe we'll summarize this. So basically, the positivist, he's showing now that Christianity can use the tools of analytic philosophy. He went back to the logical positivists, a group of analytic philosophers who wanted to break with tradition. They wanted to break with metaphysics, theology, ethics, and religious belief, and to say that all statements of theology, metaphysics, religious beliefs, ethical beliefs were meaningless. So the positive, only the observable accept it now. The positivists were stating and developing in detail an idea or trend of thought which has a long history and has a certain attraction to everyone. So stating and developing this idea, okay, which has a long history and has a certain attraction to everyone. So this idea wasn't new, but they were putting it they were trying to formulate it in a more mathematical or more rigorous sense, a more logical sense. And that stating, that formulation, that piecemeal approach is something about the analytic. This is the thought that it really makes sense to talk about something only if that thing can be perceived by the senses. Talk about such alleged entities as ghosts, the embolism of the spiritualists, fairies, and so on is, according to this tough-minded view, mere meaningless verbiage. The paradigm of a sensible statement, on the other hand, is one like the chair in the corner is brown, or this piece of paper is round. So this statement right here, he's saying is an example, a paradigm example of saying this is a paradigm example of a statement that can be verified. A sensible statement. Statements such as these, that is, statements which ascribe an observable quality, roundness, being brown, to an observable thing, a chair, a piece of paper, the positive called observation statements. Now, the positivists never said, so far as I know, that only observation statements are meaningful. But one of the earliest statements of the verifiability criterion went like this. VC1. A statement is meaningful if and only if it is or entails an observation statement. Okay, so and so what is an observation statement? He just said it here. You ascribe an observable quality to an observable thing. So you have a thing that's observable, and you predicate something about it. So if we think about a sentence, subject, and a predicate, subject needs to be something you can observe, and predicate needs to be an observable quality. And that's an observation statement. So the first criterion was that a statement had meaning if and only if it entails an observation statement. So what is entailment? He's going to define it here. Here the term entails is used in the following way, where P and Q are propositions. Now, a proposition is just a statement that is true or false. I have a video where we talk about that online. P and Q here are variables. Just like in math, a variable can have different values. So you can insert any statements into P and Q. So what he's doing is he's abstracting, creating a propositional form to show you how the logic works. So where P and Q are propositions, P entails Q means that it is impossible that P is true and Q is false. So whenever P is true, Q is also true. For example, the proposition all men are mortal in Socrates is a man entails the proposition Socrates is mortal. And the proposition there are three crows in that tree entails that the proposition there is at least one crow in that tree. Logically. According to VC, that's bothering me. According to VC1, then, all meaningful propositions entail observation statements. So, if the statement was meaningful, it has a subject that's observable, and it ascribes a predicate or property to that subject that is also observable. And if a proposition implies an observable statement, then that statement itself has meaning. Implication implies the same thing as entail or entailment. Critics were quick to point out, however, that mathematical and logical propositions do not entail observation statements. 7 plus 5 is 12, for example, does not entail any observation statement at all, and hence the positivist, if he wished to accept VC1, would have to conclude that mathematical propositions are all meaningless. Since this was a conclusion they found unpalatable, the positivists restated VC1 as follows. VC2. So let's summarize. A lot of these logical positivists really, really admired mathematics, and they thought math gave us truth. So since a mathematical statement did not entail observation statements or were not observation statements themselves. They were not observable. They did not have a subject that was an observable thing and predicate of that subject a property that was also observable. Since they didn't do that, since mathematical propositions didn't do that, then that means that mathematical propositions were meaningless. So if VC1 was true, then mathematical propositions were meaningless. It's not the case that mathematical propositions were meaningless. Therefore, they logically concluded that VC1 wasn't true. So that was an example of a refutation. VC2, they tried it again. A proposition is meaningful if and only if it either entails an observation statement or it is a tautology. Okay. So now they said, well, okay, tautology. So mathematical statements are typically and generally tautology. So they're saying, well, if so, they're trying to include mathematical propositions in this criterion so that they wouldn't get rid of math as meaningless. Now, tautology is a mathematical statement or a truth of logic, such as if Socrates is mortal, something is mortal. But this wouldn't do the trick either, for there were still many propositions which the positivists took to be meaningful and which, on VC2, turned out meaningless. Here is an example. Anything which is a crow is black. This proposition isn't a tautology and doesn't entail any observation statements. Indeed, it doesn't even entail that there are any crows. It says only that anything you care to mention is such that if it is a crow, and perhaps nothing is, then it's black. And since the positivists gave this interpretation to all universal propositions, that is, they thought that propositions of the form all X or Y really say anything which is an X is a Y. They were forced to conclude that either VC2 was mistaken or else all universal propositions are meaningless. So you couldn't take a category of things and ascribe a property to that category. So you couldn't say, and that which would really be self-refuting to the verifiability criterion itself, right? So if you say that all statements are only statements that have only statements that entails a tautology or observational statement have meaning, well, that's a universal proposition. You're taking a category of statements and you're saying which statements in that category have meaning. And so, but if no universal propositions were true, then that verifiability criterion itself, which would be a universal proposition, will have to be false. So that was a self-refuting position as well. But Alvin Plantinga doesn't show that. He's just showing that the claim was too strong, that it excluded truths that they accepted. So they couldn't accept the claim, the statement of the VC2. So they were forced to conclude that either VC2 mistaken or else all universal propositions are meaningless. Finding the latter alternative unappealing, they restated VC2 as follows. So now they restated it again. Okay. A proposition P is meaningful if and only if either 1, P is a tautology, or 2, There's another proposition such that P and this other proposition together entail an observation statement which the other proposition does not entail by itself. And this was A.J. Iyer, Language, Truth, and Logic. All crows are black, for example, doesn't entail any observation by itself, but all crows are black and this is a crow together entail the observation statement that this is black. Whereas this is a crow does not by itself entail this is black. Hence, all crows are black meets the condition for meaningfulness laid down by VC3. An opposite defect. This attempt to state the verifiability criterion does not suffer from the deficiencies of its predecessors, all of which were too strong. That is, they classified as meaningless many propositions which the positivists and everyone else clearly saw to be meaningful. Sadly enough for the positivists, however, VC3 had the opposite defect. It was far too weak. For just any proposition you please is meaningful according to VC3. Consider, for example, a peculiarly opaque utterance of the German existentialist philosopher Heidegger. The not, he says, nothing's itself. This is surely about as good a candidate for meaninglessness as anything one could find. Yet on VC3, it is perfectly meaningful. For together with if the not nothing's itself, then the table in the corner is brown, it entails the observation statement, the table in the corner is brown. So basically, you can take two statements and join them by the logical step of what's called conjunction. You can combine two statements. If it's true that the sky is blue and it's true that the dog is barking, then it's true that the sky is blue and the dog is barking. So the and would be the conjunction. So you can conjoin any statement. Basically what he's saying is that the positivists could take any statement that they felt was meaningless, join that statement by conjunction to an observation statement, and then would have to accept the statement as not meaningless that they believe was meaningless because the criterion allows for that. This criterion 3, so it was far too weak. The other two statements was too strong, and this was too weak. For together with if the not nothing's itself, then the table in the corner is brown, and it entails the observation statement, the table in the corner is brown. And it is easy to see that following this pattern, just any proposition you pick can be shown to be meaningful on VC3. So VC3 wouldn't do it for the positivists either. There were further attempts to state the verifiability criterion, but all of them met with the same fate. They all turned out to be either too strong, like VC1 and VC2, or too weak, like VC3. Okay, cross-reference Carl G. Hempel, Problems and Changes in the Empiricist Criterion of Meaning and Semantics and the Philosophy of Language, edition by Leonard Linsky. Okay, 2 lines of attack, and we're almost finished. Philosophers also began to ask about the status of the verifiability principle itself. Suppose it could be stated in a way which satisfied the positivists. Why should anyone accept it? Why shouldn't the theist retort as follows? Your criterion is obviously mistaken, for many theological statements are not empirically verifiable, but theological statements are meaningful. Hence, it is false that all and only verifiable statements are meaningful. What could the positivist reply? What sort of argument could he bring forward to show the theologian, that he ought to accept the verifiability criterion and stop proclaiming these meaningless theological pseudo statements. About all the positivists could say here would be that his criterion does fit scientific and common sense statements and doesn't fit theological statements. So basically, the claim here is that even if you could create a definition of the criterion, state the criterion in such a clear way that it's consistent with your belief system. Consistency doesn't imply truth, so why think it's true? Even if you define it well, why think it's true? And what was the argument? So this is an undercutting objection to say that there's no reason to accept it, even if you state it correctly or state it unproblematically. About all the positivists could say, yeah. And to this, the theologian could agree with equanimity. There are, no doubt, many properties which distinguish scientific and common sense statements from theological statements. But of course, that does not suffice to show that theological statements are meaningless or logically out of order or anything of the sort. Indeed, it can be shown that there can be no relevant defense of the verifiability criterion as a criterion of significance. The verifiability criterion, then, has been subjected to these two lines of attack. Its critics have shown first that every statement of the criterion proposed by the positivists is either so strong that it eliminates many statements the positivists themselves wish to accept as meaningful, that it mathematical statements, universal proposition, are so weak that just any statement turns out to be meaningful, in which case metaphysics and theology aren't eliminated at all. And secondly, it was argued that there appears to be no reason to accept the verifiability criterion. As a result of these two lines of criticism, it is today exceedingly difficult to find a philosopher who is willing, in public at any rate, to express allegiance to logical positivism. But the point I want to call attention to is this. Those philosophers who formulated and drove home the criticisms of the verifiability criterion were doing analytic philosophy. In fact, the sort of activity in which they were engaged is paradigmatic case of analytic philosophy. Is a paradigmatic case of analytic philosophy. Now, of course, some theologians were also concerned with the verifiability criterion. But for the most part, their attempts, so basically he's saying that analytic philosophers use the analytic approach to refute logical positivism. That was weird. To refute logical positivism, which so now he's saying that some theologians tried to address this verifiability criterion as well. But for the most part, their attempts to deal with it were not, I am sorry to say, of a sort calculated to win respect. I'll add that because that blue line just to win the respect and assent of an impartial observer. Typically, they were inclined to say such things as that perhaps religious statements are nonsense, all right, but then after all, we're to be fools for Christ's sake. So he's saying that their response, the response of many theologians, would say, yeah, this is nonsense, but I'm supposed to be a fool for Christ's sake. Paul said we are fools for Christ's sake. So they were taking it literally. Or they said that the beliefs of Christianity were nonsense for the unregenerate, but the believer was enabled to understand them by an infusion of divine grace. Or finally, they claimed that philosophy and reason generally have nothing at all to do with the case, that religion is a matter of the heart, Now, each of these replies may possibly have a kernel of truth in it, yet how decisive and satisfying the philosophical answers seem to be by comparison. The philosophical answer meets the positivist on his own ground and defeats him there. This, if it is possible, is surely the right thing to do. Whew. So this was, the excitement of Alvin Plantinga as a writer. He just showed that meeting that the logical positivist or the analytic philosopher had a tool where they can go to the logical positivist on ground. They can get in the ring, so to speak, and defeat their opponent there using the rules. They can play by the rules and defeat them. So Alvin Plantinga says this is the right thing to do. So if you're a scientist, you don't have to, and a Christian, you don't have to accept claims and conclusions and arguments that seek to falsify Christianity. You can follow the evidence where it leads. You can use that same scientific method to show that their conclusions aren't valid. So this is interesting. So he's saying that the Christian's response was to fall back on, basically it was to concede and to try to explain why it was nonsense. But basically to concede that it was nonsense because they couldn't speak to the logical positivists on their own ground. They couldn't get on the court with the logical positivists and beat them at their own game. So it is evident from the above, I take it, that analytic philosophy as such, as opposed to certain varieties of it, is in no way hostile to religion or theology. On the contrary, it can be a valuable apologetic tool. As the case of positivism shows, contemporary thought, both inside and outside of academic philosophy, contains much that is hostile to Christianity. The Christian intellectual community must make good use of the powerful techniques of analytic philosophy in defending its beliefs, positive values. So he's about to conclude. I said at the outset that I thought suspicion and distrust toward analytic philosophy was a great mistake on the part of those Christian theologians and intellectuals who took up such an attitude. One of my reasons for thinking has now become apparent. Analytic philosophy has a crucially important role to play in Christian apologetics. But secondly, analytic philosophy is of value to the Christian community in that it promotes clear, penetrating, and careful thinking on matters of importance. We say, for example, that God is omnipotent. Now he's going to give an example of the use of analytic philosophy by Christians, right, to think clear and penetratingly on issues of faith. Okay, so he's saying, we say, for example, and we are here. We say, for example, that God is omnipotent. What exactly do we mean when we say this? That God can do anything at all? But we don't mean to assert that God can, for example, create a square circle or perform any other contradictory action. That he can perform any logically possible or consistent action. Raising one's arm is a possible action, but we don't mean to imply that God can raise his arm, for since he is a spirit, he has no arm to raise. Again, making a table which is not made by God is a logically possible action. God certainly can't perform that action. However, for the proposition that he has performed it is self-contradictory. What then do we mean when we say that God is omnipotent, or that he is omniscient, or that he is the necessary or ultimately real being? In responsibly answering questions of this sort, the discipline, logical competence, and habits of clear and accurate thought fostered by the study of analytic philosophy are required. For these reasons, then, I believe that analytic philosophy has a most important contribution to make to the intellectual life of the Christian community. It is useful as an unapologetic tool, and it can deepen our understanding of our faith. So, let's summarize what Alvin Plantinga has said. We know that the analytic approach, you define fundamental concepts according to C.D. Broad. You analyze those fundamental concepts. That is, you examine the parts, how those parts relate together, any relationships between the parts. You critically evaluate your fundamental beliefs, and you state them clearly. That was C.D. Broad. Now, Alvin Plantinga emphasized a step-by-step investigative approach to important matters. It's piecemeal. You have a focus on argument. You examine counter-argument. And then there's a focus on clarity. He says that you don't introduce theses without argument, or you don't argue half-heartedly. And then he says you don't introduce terms without defining them. And he says how that seems simple, but it's extremely hard to do. Finally, the Christian thinker or layperson should not be suspicious of analytic philosophy, since analytic philosophy is a tool to both think deeply about our faith, and to articulate our beliefs in a systematic and clear way. We are able to defend our beliefs by beating them at their own game. By understanding the tools of analytic philosophy, we can beat philosophical attacks. We can meet them on the battlefield and beat them on a level field by using their tools. So we shouldn't be afraid. I'm Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder. Today we have looked at analytic philosophy and Christianity. Thanks for tuning in, and you have a great rest of your day.